Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shiur.
Shalom Aleichem and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi, which is Shabbos Daf Kuf Lamed Vav, one Daf Kuf Lamed Hey Amud Beis, 5 lines from the bottom. Says the Gemara Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Kol sheshah lamed yoim ba'adam einay nefel. Any newborn child who has survived, who has been living for 30 days, that determines for us with certainty that he is no longer a nefel. We don't have to suspect that he's a nefel. A nefel is an undeveloped child who is non-viable, doesn't have the ability to live. So this child, since he's reached 30 days, that determines and establishes for us that he's certainly not a nefel. He's fully developed, he's healthy, and he's going to live a long, healthy life. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, upeduyav in ben chodesh tifte. The pasuk is speaking about redeeming the firstborn, the bechor, and the pasuk stipulates that he must be at least a ben chodesh, a month old. Apparently, prior to that stage, there's some uncertainty as to his status, as to whether perhaps he's not viable, he's not developed, and therefore you need to wait until that's established with certainty, until that's demonstrated, and that takes 30 days. So that's regarding a newborn child, an Adam. What about by a behema? Shmoinas yamim b'behema ein a nefel. Likewise, when it comes to a behema, if he survived for 8 days, so that determines and demonstrates that he's not a nefel. Shenemar b'yom hashmini v'hala yiratza lekarban. So from the 8th day and on, once you reach the 8th day, Rashi points out later, it could even be already the night prior to the 8th day. Once you've entered the 8th day, that demonstrates that he is considered to be viable. He's a bar kayama. He's considered to be fully alive and well. So that takes 8 days, and we learn that from the pasuk, which says from the 8th day and on, he is to be accepted as a carbon. Apparently, you need 8 days to determine his viability. Let's take a look at Rashi. 2 lines from the bottom, beginning with the word upeduyav. Says Rashi, b'bechor adam ksiv, we're speaking about the firstborn of an Adam, ben chodesh. The fact that the Torah depends on the chodesh, shma mino, we hear from here, achshav nizbarer. Now it has become established, shu ben kayama, he's considered to be a viable child, v'loy kodim l'kein, but not prior to that stage. Now we're going to learn later that what exactly is classified as a nefel, who exactly is classified as a bar kayama. So we're going to learn later that if he's certainly a 9-month baby who was delivered during the 9th month of pregnancy, he's certainly considered to be a bar kayama. He's fully alive and well. He's certainly a non-nefel. He's fully developed, according to all shittas. If he is an 8-month child delivered within the 8th month of pregnancy, certainly he's considered to be a nefel, non-viable. He doesn't have the ability to live on. And when it comes to a ben shiva, a child born within the 7th month of pregnancy, that is considered to be a bar kayama, a viable child. So it's interesting, the 7th and the 9th are okay, and the 8th is the problematic one, and is not considered to be viable. Interesting that the Chazon Ish points out that the teva has changed, the nature of a person. Nowadays is different than even a ben shmoina, a child born within the 8th month of pregnancy, has a chance of survival. We don't regard him as a mace, as somebody who's definitely, certainly not going to survive. Now, what is the nafkamina here? What is the halachic ramification of whether he's considered to be a bar kayama, a viable child, or a nefel, non-viable? So there are several halachic nafkaminas. So when it comes to an animal, it's pretty simple, because an animal who is less than 8 days old, if we suspect that he's a nefel, a non-viable animal, you can't go do the shechita and eat it, because he's regarded legally as not alive, as not a living. He's not regarded as a living creature, so you can't do shechita and eat it. And when it comes to an Adam, so for instance, if his mother, if he's the only child, his father died childless, he's the only remaining descendant. So the halacha is that a childless woman needs to have yibum, the brother of the dead person needs to marry, or chalitza, move the shoe. So the process of yibum and chalitza needs to be fulfilled if there is no child. The question is this fellow, this kid who is less than 30 days, is he regarded as a viable child, as a living being, thereby exempting his mother from Yibum or Chalitza, because his father did not die childless? Or do we say perhaps, since he died within 30 days, we're unsure. We suspect perhaps he wasn't a Bar Kayam, he was a Neifel, he was not viable. He's not regarded as a living being, a living human. And this results in his mother, necessitating his mother to Yibum or Chalitza. So according to Shimon Gamliel again, a Adam needs to survive at least for 30 days to determine and establish for us with certainty that he is not a Neifel, that he's viable, he's fully developed, and is regarded as a legal Adam. When it comes to a Behema, it needs to be 8 days to establish the viability there. Continues the Gemara. But if the child has not yet survived for 30 days, Sfeika Havi, he's regarded as a Safek, we're uncertain as to his status. Says the Gemara, Mimal Heichimalinale. If so, how can we ever go ahead and do Mila on the 8th day, which falls out on Shabbos? It's prior to 30 days. We're unsure of whether this child is going to survive. And if he's a Neifel, if he's an undeveloped newborn, then there's no mitzvah of Mila here. So how could you do the malacha of Mila on Shabbos if there's any suffix, any uncertainty? Omar of Adabar Ava, there's no problem. Either way, you're okay. You can do the Mila. Why? Im chayu, if he is regarded as a chay legally, as a viable child, if he is in reality a fully developed child, whose months of development were completed, and he's going to survive and live, then he has a mitzvah, there's an obligation to do Mila on Shabbos. Shaper Kamal, then it's proper. He's doing a proper Mila. V'im lav. Now on the other side of the coin, perhaps he's undeveloped. We have not yet determined his viability, so perhaps he's not developed. And there is no chiv of Mila. There's no problem. He's simply cutting meat. He's cutting the dead meat, because this child is legally not regarded as a living being. He's not capable of surviving. So you're merely cutting flesh, you're cutting basar. There's no concern of chabur. You're not doing a malacha on Shabbos. Because what's the malacha of making a wound on Shabbos? Inflicting a wound involves the malacha of netilas neshama. You're taking out some blood, which removes some of the neshama, because the neshama of the person or the animal is embedded in the blood. But this child here is not regarded as a living being. So there's no malacha taking place in either case. Continues the Gemara. So how are we going to explain the Brisa which says Safek ben Zayin, Safek ben Ches? If we have a newborn infant regarding whom we were uncertain of whether he's a ben Sheva, if he was born within the 7th month of pregnancy, or whether he is a ben Shmoina born within the 8th month of pregnancy, in which case he's not viable. So there's a Safek of whether he's 7 and he's developed properly, or 8th and he won't survive. In this case, we cannot be Machal Shabbos. We can't do the Bris Milah for this child if his 8th day falls out on Shabbos, because we're uncertain as to the status of this child, or whether he's considered a Neifel, and there's no Chiva Bris. So we can't do the Milah on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, but according to you, what's the problem? Amai, why? Let him do the Milah to this child. Either way, you're okay. Im Chayu. If it turns out that he's a viable child, Shaper Kamal, then he's doing a proper Milah. Vim lav. But if in reality he's an undeveloped child, he's a Neifel, he's simply cutting meat, and there's no problem. So why does the Brisa tell us that one is prevented from doing the Milah when we have an uncertainty as to the status of a child, of whether or not he's developed? Do it either way. Says the Gemara, Omar Mar Bereder Ravina. So Mar, the son of Ravina, said, Ano, myself, V'Rav Nechumi bar Zachariah. So myself and Rav Nechumi bar Zachariah Targimna, we interpreted, we answered this kasha. Mimel hachinami malinale. Certainly we do the Milah. Of course, the Brisa was not saying that one cannot do the Milah. The Milah is allowed either way, mimanavshach. Either it's a mitzvah or he's doing nothing. Loi nitzrucha. The Brisa is only prohibiting in the case of Elul Machshirei Milah. V'aliva d'Rabbi Lezer. The Brisa is referring to the machshirim, the preliminaries, the preparations for the Milah. Cutting down the tree to make the coals, to develop the knife, all those hachanes of the bris, which Rabbi Lezer allows to be done on Shabbos as well. And those are certainly malachas. So when we have a suffix as to the status, the legal status of this child, whether or not he's a nefil, whether or not he requires a bris, we can't go ahead and do those machshir mila which involve certain malachas. There are certainly malachas being done there. So in that case, he's prevented from doing that. But the mila itself, there's no discussion. Of course, you can do it. Either it's a mitzvah, or there's no malacha at all. Let's take a look at Rashi inside. Rashi up on top of the Amud, beginning with the words Mimal Heichi Me'alina, on the first line. Says Rashi, how can we do Mila to any child? Shum Katan B'Yom HaShmini B'Shabbos, whose 8th day falls on Shabbos. The Mila Neifalu, perhaps he's a Neifel. He's not suitable for Mila. Thereby resulting in doing a Chabura without the purpose of a mitzvah. Says the Gemara, there's no concern. Im Chayu Kalaymar. It means to say like this: Im Koloi Chadashav, if he is a fully developed fetus, fully developed infant, Shapir Kamal, then he's doing a proper Mila. But otherwise, he's simply cutting meat. It's not considered a chabura. If so, why does the Brisa not allow a Mila? The Gemara concluded, when the Brisa says he can't do chilul, elul in the machshir Mila, Rabbi Lezer was speaking about preparing the Mila according to Rabbi Lezer, the Amar Dachus Shabbos. He holds that the preparation of Dachus Shabbos, that's only in a case where we are certain, we are sure positively that this child is a fully developed child, but when there's any degree of uncertainty, we cannot do the machshir Shabbos. So when does he allow Hani Mila as only the Kinle Begavei Shekol Chadashav? He knows with certainty that this child's months will complete it fully, he's fully developed. She'avru Tes Chadashim, that 9 months have passed. Misha Shimsha, when the Isha had Tashmish, Ad She'aldas, until she gave birth to him. Shimsha Kol Yimei Bura, and she did not do Tashmish all throughout the expectancy period. Our suffix, but when we have a suffix, a machshir deichen, this suffix fellow, his machshirim, his preliminaries do not override Shabbos. Dilma, perhaps, lav bar mimalhu. He's not one who requires milah. Umechal Shabbos. Thereby, the person preparing is doing chilul Shabbos by soisei pechamim barza when he develops and makes the coals and the metal. He forms the metal for his knife. Continues the Gemara. So we have a interesting point here that when a child is not viable, he's regarded as legally maced, like he's dead, lifeless, and therefore one can simply cut through without any concern. This concept that something which is not viable, which doesn't have the ability to survive, is regarded even currently as a mace, as a non-living entity, is actually based on a machlekes tanoim. The Brisa is speaking about an animal, and the Brisa says like this: The pasuk says, when an animal which is edible to you will die. And Rashi brings the Brisa and Teres Kainim, that the Gemara makes a drasha from here, Lahavi, to include Ben Shmoina, that even an animal who's living, but he was a Ben Shmoina, he was born during the 8th month of pregnancy. So generally the Behema Gasa, this big Behema like a cow, requires 9 months of pregnancy like a human being. So if he is born during the 8th month, in which case he's considered to be non-viable, a nefel. So if a person does shchita to this calf, she'ein shchitasa mitarzi, that a shchita applied to this animal who's considered a nefel, an undeveloped animal, the shchita is not mitar, does not spare him from tumah, and he's considered to be like a dead animal, like a nevela, and is matami. So that's what we learn from this pasuk. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon, Oimrim, they say, no, shchitasa mitarasai. The shchita done, applied to a ben shmoina, to an animal born after 8 months of pregnancy, the shchita will be matayirit. It is regarded as a legally valid shchita. Says the Gemara, Maila Bakamiflagi. Apparently, what is the point of the machlekes? It is based on this question. The Mar Savar Chayu, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Lezer, they hold that since he's alive and well, he's walking around, he seems to be perfectly alive, even though he's not capable of living long term, he's not viable. Nevertheless, at the present moment, he's regarded as a chayz living being, and you could be shaychid him and prevent him from becoming tummy. Umasav Mesu. Tanakama maintains, since he is slated to die eventually, he doesn't have the capability of living long term, he's regarded even currently as a mace, since he's a nefel. Therefore, shchita cannot be applied to this animal. So apparently this concept of whether or not we regard a nefel as currently alive or not depends on these two opinions. Likewise, when it comes to the child who was born after 8 months, so he's an 8-month child who's not viable. The question whether or not we can do a milah to this child, the svara mentioned earlier that there's no concern because you're simply cutting the basar. It's simply a dead being. That seems to be hinging on this machlekes. Machlekes Tanoi. Amar Rava, if that's the proper interpretation, if that's the case, ademiflagi linyan tumah v'tahara. Rather than have a machlekes pertaining to tumah and tahara, whether or not the shechita has the ability to spare this animal from becoming tameh or not, why discuss that? Liflagi linyan achila. Why don't they have their machlekes pertaining to a more simple discussion, a more simple context of achila, whether or not the shechita permits the animal to be eaten? And according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Shimon, even this nefel, whose shechita was done to it, will be mutar b'achila. It seems to be a greater chiddush. Number one. Number two, this is the primary halacha. Shechita is primarily coming to be mater b'achila. And that would be the proper context of their machlekes. Meaning that once it allows it to be eaten, certainly it spares it from becoming tamei, but that's secondary. Why don't they discuss the din of shechita, if this indeed is the point of the machlekes? Ella says Rava the kulam and Mesu all agree, the Tanakam and Rabbi Yisrael and Rabbi Elazar agree that this nefel has a din of a mace. We currently view him as a non-living entity, and therefore when it comes to milah on Shabbos, there's no concern, because if he's a ben shmoina, you're simply cutting flesh and not doing a malach. So it's agreed upon by all. So what then is the point of the machlekes? Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Savri, they hold that despite the fact that legally he's considered a mace, nevertheless shechita can do something here. It's not going to allow the thing to be eaten, because certainly we don't consider him to be a chai. He's not a proper living entity. He's slated to die. He's not going to survive. But just as we find kitreifa, just as we find when it comes to a treifa, an animal who has an internal a blemish, a vital organ missing, or some sort of critical injury, and it doesn't have the ability to survive long term, there's a chiddush there. Despite the fact that he's a treifa and he's usher to be eaten, but if one does shechita to a treifa, we learn from a pasuk that he's metayr the animal from tumah. The shechita works somewhat in a limited fashion. Treifa laf afal gab the mesahi. Although a treifa has a din of a mesa, meaning it's not viable, it's going to die, and one cannot eat it, it's not considered to be a fully living creature. Nevertheless, shechitasa metarasa. If one does shechita the treifa, it is metar the treifa, prevents it from becoming an avela. So we see that shechita can have a partial effect on an animal, although it's not allowing it to be eaten, but it's preventing it from becoming tamei. Likewise, in our case, of the animal who was born during the 8th month of pregnancy, who is considered to be undeveloped, a nefel, considered to be a mace. Hachanami here as well, loishna. There's no difference, meaning that the shechita applied to this ben shmoina should at least be metayired from tumah. So this is their view. They compare this case of a ben shmoina to the case of a treifa, and therefore the shechita is metayired, despite the fact that it is not materet b'achila. What does the Tanakam hold? It says the Rabbanon hold loy damali treifa. You can't compare it. This is not meant to be compared to a treifa. Why? Treifa is shasa kosher. A treifa animal had a moment of fitness prior to the animal having developed its internal critical injury. So, since it had a moment, shasa kosher, where the shechita would have been fully effective, it was just a typical standard animal. Therefore, the animal maintains that status somewhat, and shechita can be applied to it, even after it attained its treifa status. It was classified as a treifa. So that's the advantage that a treifa has over and above our case, high in our case, of the animal born within the 8th month of pregnancy, a ben shmoina. It never had a moment of fitness from the moment that it was born. It was It was invalidated. It was non-viable. And never had a moment of fitness to have the shchita and to apply proper shchita. Therefore, we can't compare the two things. And therefore, the Tanakh holds that a shchita applied to the ben shmoina does not work in any way, is not effective, and does not spare it from tumah. Says if you'll challenge, treifa mi beta meikel meimar. What about a treifa? Mi betan, he was born missing some sort of vital internal organ, which renders him a treifa, so he never had a moment of fitness. It was something which he was born with. So how can you say that a treifa can have shchita, despite the fact that there's no shasa kosher? Says the Gemara, there's still a difference. Hasam, over there by a treifa, yesh b'mina shchita. In its min, in its kind, shchita can apply, meaning a fully developed animal has shchita. So although this specific animal, this individual is a treifa, but in its kind, in its class, in its type of animals, fully developed animals, shchita is legal, is valid. So it has an advantage over this ben shmoina, this premature animal born as a nefel. Hacha ein b'mina shchita. In this case, its kind does not have shchita. Meaning, since he's a nefel, he's regarded as a mace. So all these premature animals don't have shchita because shchita can only apply to a living being as opposed to an animal which is legally defined as a mace. So in summary, regarding an uber who's a ben shmoina chadashim, who's considered a nefel, so either an adam or behema, born within the 8th month of pregnancy. Now, if it's a newborn child whom we suspect that perhaps he's a 8-month child, the Gemara tells us you can do milah to this child because either way, because even if he's really a ben shmoina chadashim and he's regarded as a nefel, non-viable, you're simply cutting this flesh, which is dead meat. When it comes to a behema who was born a ben shmoina chadashim and regarded as a nefel, he's also ba'achila. Now, regarding whether the shchita is mitar this animal from tumah, we have machlekes. Continues the Gemara. Okay, so let's get back to the beginning of the sugya. Reb Shimon Gamliel tells us that in order to ascertain that this child, this newborn child, or this offspring, this animal, is not a nefel, in order to establish that he's considered to be viable, a bar kayama, fully living, you need to wait. By an adam, you need to wait 30 days. By behema, it needs to be up to the 8th day. Says the Gemara, so they asked the following question: Mi pligi rabbanan, olei de Reb Shimon Gamliel? Do the rabbanan disagree with this concept, or do they agree with him? They need to wait this period to demonstrate his viability. Intim salomia pligi. If you maintain that they disagree, they don't require. They say, well, let's follow the majority. The majority of women give birth to viable children. The majority of animals give birth to viable offspring. So they disagree with him. If that's the case, halacha kamaisei, do we follow, does the halacha rule like Reb Shimon Gamliel? Or yein halacha kamaisei, do we not paskin like him? Tishma, come and listen to the following right. Egel shenoiled b'yomtiv, a calf who was born on yomtiv itself, sheichten oiseh b'yomtiv. You can go ahead and be sheichet on yomtiv. Apparently, even a 1-day-old calf is mutar ba'achila. You don't need to wait to the 8th day, because otherwise, how can you go ahead and do shchita on Yom Tov to eat it? Hachab mayaskina, and says, you know what we're speaking about? We're not speaking about your typical offspring, in which there's some degree of uncertainty. We suspect perhaps he's undeveloped. The pregnancy only stretched for 8 months, and it wasn't fully developed. Hachab mayaskina, we're speaking about the kimle begave. He knows with certainty regarding this offspring, shekol chadashav, that his months were fully completed, meaning he's a fully developed child. He knows for certainty that he's fully developed, in which case there's no chashash, there's no suspicion of any nefel, and therefore certainly he's mutar b'achila. Continues the Gemara Toshma. Come and listen to the following right. Vishavan, they both agree. Rashi will explain for us that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, who disagree regarding a bechor, a firstborn animal, who needs to have a mum, a blemish, in order to allow its shchita outside the Beis HaMikdash. Now, according to Rabbi Shimon, we cannot go ahead and examine the bechor and Yom Tov. he's repairing. It looks like he's being masakin. It looks like he's doing a din Torah. So, generally speaking, it doesn't allow examining the b'chor to ascertain, to determine whether it's considered to be a significant mum. But they both agree, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon both agree, if the animal was born together with his blemish. So you had a mum at the get-go, right when he was born. This is regarded as a prepared animal, since there was never a point in time in which the Issa was established. Meaning, since he was born with the mum, so his coming into this world wasn't a manner of being fully prepared for the shechita, and therefore all agree that this type of animal can be shechter on Yom Tov. Rashi says that Dayana was sitting there during the birth, and they right away determined that this is considered to be a proper mum. In any case, the Mishnah tells us, Mishnah or Brisa tells us that one can go ahead and be sheiched this newborn b'chor on Yom Tov. How can you do that? You didn't wait 8 months, 8 days. Perhaps he's a nafel. Perhaps he's not viable. Perhaps he's also bachil. Says more here as well. We're speaking that this farmer, he knows with certainty that this animal who was born is fully developed. His months were fully developed, and he's considered to be viable. So there's no suffix here, and therefore there's no problem. Toshma, come listen to the following Gemara. The Amar Avidam Shmuel halacha. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. The halacha follows Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's view. Apparently, halacha, the fact that he had to go ahead and say halacha, apparently others disagree with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Shema Mino, indeed, this is a right. So it appears that the Rabbanon will follow the right. They say, well, since most women and most animals give birth to viable children and offspring, we follow the right as we do all over the Torah. In contrast with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who maintains that this is different. When it comes to these offspring, to the children of offspring, since there's a sizable minority, the Mepharshim say it's a mir tamotzi, it is common for there to be a nafel, non-viable child, an undeveloped child or offspring. We must suspect that perhaps this child as well is not viable. Some explain that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel actually learns this from the pasuk. As we began with the Gemara before, that we learned from the pasuk of Bechor, where the Torah specifically tells us that a child is different. We don't follow the roif. An animal, a newborn animal is different. We don't follow the roif. So this is a din Torah. The Torah excludes our sugya, our topic, and differentiates, draws that line between our discussion and the rest of the Torah. In our case, we don't follow the roif. We have reason to suspect that perhaps he's not viable, and we're meant to follow even the miyut, a minority, and suspect and be choishish that perhaps it's a nafel. Therefore, we need to ascertain with certainty. We have to wait a period of time of survival to demonstrate and to determine and establish the child's viability. Continues the Gemara. Okay, now that we've established that there's a machlekes going on here, that according to one shita you need to wait to establish viability, whereas according to the other shita, we're not concerned, we don't have a suffix. Now, what is the context of their discussion? What were the circumstances surrounding the death of the child or the offspring? How did it happen? Rabbi, Nafal min Agag. Let's say the child, he died as a result of external causes. So he hadn't yet reached the point of 30 days, and he died somewhere before that. But it was a result of an external cause. For instance, Nafal min Agag, he fell off a roof. Oy, Achlei Ari, attacked by a lion. So in this case, Divrei Akol Chayu. All agree, even Rabbi Shimon Gamliel agrees, that we regard him legally as a chai. There's no reason to suspect that he's a nafel. Why? Because firstly, we have the roiv. The majority of women give birth to healthy children. And number two, there was no exhibition of any erasa, any indication that he was weak or lacking in health. He died simply as a result of a lion. Therefore, even according to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, we regard him as a proper living child, a proper bar kayama. And as we discussed earlier, if his father died childless and he's the only surviving son, he exempts his mother from yibum, from chalitza. He's considered to be a proper child. Divrei Akol Chayu, all agree that he's chay. Ki pligi, when then is there machlekes shepia kemes? Let's say he was born and then he simply yawned and died. In which case, there's a reisa here. there's an indication of some internal weakness. He displayed weak vital signs. So we have a reason to suspect, to establish a notion that he wasn't viable. So that is the basis of their machlekes. This is the context of the machlekes. Mar savar chayu. The Rabbanan maintain, nevertheless, he's regarded as chay. We follow the majority. We have no reason to think otherwise. Umar savar mesu. However, if Shimon Gamliel holds, we must suspect that he's a nefel, that he wasn't viable. Now, what is the halachic ramification of this? Lifter min yibum, as we discussed earlier, to exempt his mother from yibum. So if he's regarded as a chay, then he exempts his mother. But otherwise, there's a suffix regarding his ability to live on, whether or not he's a bar kayama, and therefore his mother must address the chiv yibum. She must at least do chalitza on account of this suffix. Let's see Rashi inside here. So Rashi is off to the right side, just a couple of lines up, 4 or 5 lines up, beginning with the words Nafal min hagag o'yochlari. Says Rashi, Shemes machmas misa, he died as a result. So within 30 days he died as a result of an external cause. In that case, Divrei HaKoil all agree b'cheskas kol chadashev. We presume that his months were fully completed. He's a fully developed child. Koi, di lav hachmisa. If not for this external cause of death, he wouldn't have died. Hilka chayu, we regard him as fully alive. Ubadam have a vlad. So when it comes to a child, he's considered to be a vlad. Upatiras imoy minachalitza, and he exempts his mother from chalitza. V'gab behema nami. Likewise, by behema, stam vlad behema, sheshachad v'soiches. Any vlad, any offspring, who he did shchita to within 8 days, so he hadn't yet waited for that 8-day period, mutar b'achili, can go and eat it. Why? Because here too the cause of death is external, the shchita, put him to death. Since we had not noticed any reyesa, any exhibition of weakness, any indication of an internal weakness, then we follow the Rav. Most bearers of children, most women or animals give birth to healthy children. However, if it was shepiek, bailer belaz, some type of yon, kalaima, for instance, la'achar leidasai. So he means to say that after his birth, only noticed some weak vital signs, a little bit chiyus, shapir kemes. He simply yawned and died. Speaking about a person, a child who died. So according to the first approach to the Gemara, if there was an external cause of death, all agree there's no reason to suspect that he's a nefel. If there was an internal cause of death, he showed weak vital signs, which is a reyesa. It's an indication that there's something wrong here. He's lacking in his chiyus and his health. So we go ahead and we suspect that he was a nefel because he had not yet reached the 30-day period or the 8-day period. And this is the shita of Rav Shimon Gamliel, whereas according to Rabbanan, we follow the majority, we assume that he was a healthy child. Says the Gemara, let's go back. Can you say that if there was this external cause, falling off the roof, attacked by a lion, all agree that he's regarded as a chay? How could that be? We have a story which indicates otherwise. Papa, so these two, they visited the home of Brei, the Ravidi bar Avin, the son of Ravidi Avin. So he prepared a meal for his guest, and he prepared for them igla tilsa, a third-born calf. It's considered to be something chashav. B'yimam the shiva. It was on the 7th day, so this calf was only 7 days old. On his 7th day, va'amarle, and they told him, sorry, we can't eat it. If you would have delayed the shchita of this animal ad l'urta, at least until nightfall, in which the 8th day would have already entered, we would have eaten from it. Hashta, but now it was premature. We can't eat from it. Now we're speaking about death as a result of an external cause. It was shchita here. Apparently there's a concern even in this case. Says we must switch things around. Ella, rather, when he exhibited weak vital signs and he died, all agree, even the Rabbanan agree, that he's regarded, we suspect, that perhaps he's mace, he's a nefel, he's not viable, he had no ability to carry on, to live on. Why? Because there was a reyes here. There was an exhibition of weakness. So all agree to that. Ki pligi, when then? Is there a machlekes? Benafel menagag ba'achleari, when there was an external cause of death, falling off the roof, attacked by a lion. Marsav amesu. Rishon Gamliel holds that if he has not yet reached the point of 30 days, we regard him, we suspect, we are choishish, that he's amazed, that he's a nefel. Marsav achayu. The Rabbanan say no, he doesn't need to establish his non-viability. He can go ahead and be considered like a viable child, even though he hasn't reached the point of 30 days. So once again, all agree that if he was merely piyakames, we suspect that he is a nefel. If he had an external cause of death, then there's a machlekes. And indeed, these Rav Papa and Rav Huna Yeshua, they were following the halacha, like Rav Shimon Gamliel. We learned earlier that the halacha, paskins like him, therefore they withheld, they prevented from consuming this animal, since the shechita took place prior to the 8th day. So in summary, regarding an Adam who is less than 30 days old, or behema less than 8 days old, so it depends. If we know with certainty that this offspring is 9 months old, he had a full development period, all agree that he's considered a chai. If there's a suffix here, we're uncertain as to the point of his development, the Gemara concluded, it depends. If pieku meis, if he yawned and died, in which case he exhibits weakness, all agree he's regarded as a meis. There's a suffix nefel here. When we have a case of a child who we're unsure of whether or not he's fully developed, he's a suffix, but he died within 30 days as a result of an external cause, for instance, falling off the roof, then we have a machlekes. According to Shimon Gamliel, we suspect that he's meis. He's a suffix nefel. We're not sure regarding his status. Perhaps he's not viable. He needs to determine that by waiting 30 days, according to Chachamim. Even within 30 days, he's considered to be perfectly alive and well. As we explained, since the roiv, the majority of women, give birth to healthy, viable children. Plus, there was no exhibition of weakness here. He died due to an external cause. Therefore, we consider him legally chai. Continues the Gemara. Breid Rav Dimi bar Yosef, the son of Rav Dimi bar Yosef, is Yal Lehu Yenuka. So he had this newborn child, begoit las in Yom Shachav, and he passed away within 30 days. Yosef kam esabel avei. So his father was sitting and mourning on account of him. Amalei avua. So his father told him, Savronisa kabois lamechal. You'd like to eat the goodies, the food that is served to the mourners. Why are you doing avelas for this child who passed away within 30 days? It's a suffix of whether he's considered to be a nefel, and there's no need to do avelas here. Amar lei, so the father responded, Kimli bey shekol chadashav. I know with certainty regarding this child that he's fully developed, and therefore there's no suffix at all. He's considered to be a bar kayama, which necessitates avelas. Rav Ashi ikla bei Rav Kahana. Rav Ashi visited the home of Kahana, Isra bei Milsa. A tragedy happened there, begod in Yemen, and Rav Kahana's child passed away within 30 days. Chazir di Yosef become a sabel. So Rav Ashi noticed that Rav Kahana was sitting and doing avelos on him. Or Malaysia, he told him, do you not hold Laha, Damar Bidu, Amar Shmuel? Halacha. Rav Shimon Gamliel, that unless he's 30 days old, you must suspect that he's a nefel, and there's no chiv of avelos. Or Malaysia, he told him, Kimli begavei shekol lechadashav. Here as well, he said, I know with certainty that he was a fully developed child, his months were fully completed, in which case there's no suffix at all. All agree, in this case, that he's regarded as a viable child, and avelos is required. Itzma, we learned, meis, b'sech shloishim, v'omda v'neskacha. This woman went ahead and accepted kiddushin. She was betrothed, she got engaged to somebody, in a situation where her child had passed away within 30 days. And this was the only child. Now she thought, since she had a child, she wasn't childless. She's not required to do yibum chalitza. She went ahead and she accepted kiddushin from a fellow. Now, since he passed away within 30 days, it seems that at least there's a suffix here. We have an uncertainty regarding the status of this child. Now, if he is a nefel, if we have reason to believe that he's not a viable child, he's not a bar kayom, he's not a chai, then it turns out that her husband died childless, and she is required to undergo chalitza or yibum. So he died within 30 days, and she mistakenly thought this is considered to be a proper child, and she went and she was in Skadish to somebody. Omar Avinu Mishmei Derava. It depends. What are we going to do? Im Yisraeli, Im Eshes Yisraeli. If the fellow who was Mekadish's person is a Yisrael, so she's slated to marry a Yisrael who's allowed to marry Isha who did Chalitza, then there's no problem. Chayletzes. So she does Chalitza on account of uncertainty, of suffix. Perhaps this child that passed away was not regarded as a real child, he's a nefel, therefore the father passed away childless and she needs Chalitza, so do Chalitza and then proceed with the marriage. But if she's the wife of a Kohen, meaning she's slated to marry a Kohen, the person who was Mekadosh was a Kohen, and we know that a Kohen cannot marry an Isha who is a Chalutza, then we apply a leniency. We are Mekel. We say, look, let's follow the sheet of the Rabbanan, who say that even a child who passes away within 30 days is considered to be a proper child, a viable child, and we assume that the father who passed away here was not childless and does not require chalitza for his wife. She does not do chalitza. Let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi up on top on the first line. Im eishes kohen Israeli, im einay kohen zeshen skashalei. If this fellow who she was in Skadish to, this fellow who betrothed her, who engaged her, is not a kohen, so then umut b'chalitza. And b'chalutza, and he is allowed to marry Isha who is a chalutza. Chayletzes me'asafek v'achach tenasa, and then she would marry him. V'im kohen who, however, if he's a kohen, shim tachlis, if she does chalitza te'asurla, it should be asatim. Samchina the Rabbanan, we rely on the lenient sheet of the Rabbanan. Rabbanan, we say, love nefelu, this child who died within 30 days, is not considered to be a nefel. He's considered to be a perfectly legally valid and viable child, ve'ena chaletzes, and therefore she doesn't do chalitza. So this is the ruling that Ravina presented in the name of Rav. Rav Shravi Mishvei Rav Amar, he quoted Rav as follows: Achazu v'achazu. Whether this case or that case, chayletzes, in both cases she needs chalitza. We don't rely on the sheet of the Rabbanan. Ahamali Ravina Rav Shravi. So Ravina came to back up his version. He said to Rav Shravi, "Bu'urta Amar Rav, indeed, at night, Rava taught, as you said, that in both cases, by the Yisrael and the Kohen, chalitza is required. However, let's suffer in the morning, he changed his mind. And he adopted a more lenient approach and allowed the Eshes Kohen to forego the chalitza. And we rely on the Rabbanan that this child who died prematurely is considered to be a viable child. Amar lei, so Rav Shravya expressed his disapproval. He said, Sharisua? You allow this woman to get married without a chalitza, and you transgress the shita, the words of Rav Shimon Gamliel. Yehi Rava, it should be the will of Hashem, to tishrut harba, that you should even go ahead and permit forbidden fats. So he was expressing his approval in a very sharp way. And no, you cannot differentiate between Yisrael and Kohen who went to follow the shita of Rav Shimon Gamliel. This child who died prior to 30 days is suspected of being a nefel, and therefore this Isha must be treated as a childless woman and requires chalitza. Now there's an interesting kasha here. Under what circumstance did this child pass away? The Gemara said the child died b'tzarich shleishim. Now we learned earlier that all agree that if a child was pi'ei kumeis, he died as a result of his weakness, he exhibited weak vital signs. That's considered a reisa. That leads us to the notion that this child was internally deficient. And all agree that if this child passes away before 30 days, before having determined and demonstrated for us that he is a proper child, that he's a viable child, all agree, even the Rabbanan agree, that we must suspect that he's a nefel. So what's the pshat here regarding this child who passed away within 30 days? That we say that the Rabbanan considered him to be a proper child, and therefore Rava was mekel by the Eshes Kohen. The chalitza is not required, relying on the Rabbanan. Since he passed away from internal causes, even the Rabbanan would seem to agree that he's considered to be a suffix nefel. So the Farshim point out that apparently he died as a result of an illness. He fell ill, he was sick. It wasn't simply pi'ei kumeis, he yawned and just passed away suddenly. Now, dying as a result of illness is something which is unfortunately common. It doesn't necessarily expresses a state of non-viability. It doesn't necessarily indicate that he was a nefel. So this is different than the Piyah Kumeis, in which the Rabbanan agreed to Rav Shimon Gamliel. In the case of a child who was cholomeis, he fell ill and then died, this is different. And the Rabbanan would maintain that even though it was within 30 days, we don't have reason to suspect that he was a nefel. We regard him as a full-fledged child, and therefore his mother is not a yevama, she doesn't need chalitza. Continues the Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda Matir, this is going back to the Mishnah earlier, on Daf Kuf Lamed Daled, regarding a milah performed on Shabbos. The Mishnah told us that an androgynous, this child was born with male and female organs, so he's a combined creature here. The milah applied to this child is only on account of uncertainty. It's a safek chiyuv, therefore we can't do it on Shabbos, even though the 8th day fell out on Shabbos. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says you can do the milah on Shabbos. Read the matir by androgynous, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, he's regarded as a zachar. Says the Gemara, Amar Shezi or Chizda, loy lekoil, not regarding all matters, all contexts of halacha. Amar Rabbi Yehuda androgynous zachar, not regarding everything. Does Rabbi Yehuda regard the androgynous as a zachar? Why? Shema to Omer came because if you maintain that for everything Rabbi Yehuda regards this fellow as a zachar with certainty, if so, be'erchen yarech, when it comes to erchen, which is where a person commits himself, he makes some sort of neder to Hashem that he's going to bring the value of a specific individual to Hashem, to the Beis Hamikdash. Torah delineates, lists for us the value of male, female, depending on the age. And we know that an androgynous does not have this halacha. If one makes an erech of an androgynous, he says, I'm going to give the value, the erech of the androgynous, he's not obligated to bring anything. Now, if according to Rabbi Yehuda, the androgynous is regarded as a zachar regarding all matters, so why not? Again, loy lekoil amar Rabbi Yehuda androgynous zachar. Shema to Omer came because if you maintain that he's regarded as a definite zachar, if so, be'erchen yarech. When it comes to erchen, you should be able to do the erech on this child, on this person. How do we know that androgynous you cannot apply erech to? The Sani is learned in the Brisa. Ha-zachar. The pasuk has an extra word, ha-zachar. The value of a ha-zachar. The pasuk here is coming to exclude the veloy tumtum androgynous. It needs to be a definite zachar, as opposed to a tumtum who's the ivarim of the zachar of his male organ is covered over, so there's an uncertainty as to his status. Androgynous, or this fellow who exhibits both indicators. So this is excluded from the pasuk of Azachar, that he cannot have the erech. He's not valued. He's not put into the same category as a zachar. Yocha lo yehei berech ish. Perhaps, okay, he's not valued as an ish. Avol yehei berech isha. Perhaps he is categorized with regard to the value of erchen like an isha. Talmud loyma hazachar v'im nekeva. So there are two exclusions here. First hazachar, and then by nekeva it says v'im nekeva. There's an extra word v'im. V'im nekeva hi. So we learn from here that it needs to be both. It needs to be zachar vaday, a definite zachar, as opposed to the tumtum, where there's some uncertainty as to his status. And likewise an androgynous, who's this combined creature. So he's not a zachar vaday. Likewise, it needs to be nekeva vadois, a definite nekeva, as opposed to these two individuals. V'loy tumtum androgynous. So this is a brayso in Teres Kainim. Now who's the author of this brayso? V'stam safra, Rabbi Yehuda. This is a brayso in Teres Kainim, and we know that an anonymous brayso in Teres Kainim is Rabbi Yehuda. So it's compatible, follows Rabbi Yehuda's shita, is authored by Rabbi Yehuda. So apparently, when it comes to the parsha of erchen, this androgynous is not regarded as a zachar. We also learned likewise that when it comes to a different halacha, a different context, even Rabbi Yehuda does not consider the androgynous as a zachar. The Mishnah says, all are capable of doing kiddush. We're speaking about kiddush mechatas, the paraduma water, placing the ashes on the water. So all are allowed to do that, chutz, except for mecherish, shoyte v'katan. Cherish is a deaf dumb, deaf mute. Shoyte deranged, v'katan or minor. Rabbi Yehuda machshav v'katan, he allows a katan, u'poisel b'isha, u'v'androgynous. And he prohibits an isha or an androgynous from performing the kiddush mechatas. So apparently, an androgynous is classified like an isha. Shma mina. So indeed, we hear from here that androgynous is not regarded like a zachar in all contexts. If so, why is milah different? Why is milah different? Why, when it comes to milah, does Rabbi Yehuda obligate the androgynous to undergo a milah Definitively, Mishum Dechsiv, because the Torah says, Himoy lochem kol zachar. So the kol is coming to include even androgynous, and there's a chi of mila on androgynous. It's not really a suffix, it's a chi of vada. So the Farshim explain. So in the final analysis of things, what is the difference? How can we differentiate? How can we find an explanation? What is unique about mila? So explanation given is that although this fellow is regarded as a combined male and female, he's a joint zachar nekeva. He doesn't have he's not fully statused as a male or as a female. So he doesn't have a din of a zachar vadai. With regard to erchen, likewise when it comes to the kiddush mechatos, he has an aspect, an element of a female, of a nekeva. So that's regarding other halachas. Mila is different. Mila is unique. The mitzvah of Mila doesn't necessarily require a fellow who is completely, comprehensively, definitively classified as a zachar. Even if he merely has the aver, the organ of the zachar, he has the urla there. So the mitzvah Mila focuses on the physical phenomena. He has the aver of the zachar, he has the urla, that needs to be removed. The chi of Mila applies to the zachrus of this fellow. So although legally, halachically, he is classified as a zachar, a combined zachar nekeva, a partnership, so to speak, a new status perhaps. But when it comes to mitzvah mila, which is done on the zachrus of the zachar, on the url of the zachar, so as long as he has that is sufficient to be mechayiv, to obligate a mitzvah mila, and it's done b'turas vadai definitively, and as according to Rabbi Yehuda, and it's a chiyav vadai, and it's done even on Shabbos. Okay, time for a brief chazorah of today's daf. We learned that a newborn child who is less than 30 days old, or a behema offspring, which is less than 8 days old, do we suspect perhaps that they are non-viable, they are nafil? So it depends. We have 3 categories. When we know for certainty, we are positive that they have completed their full terms. For instance, this newborn child who has certainly been developed for 9 months, in that case we regard him as full-fledged chai, as a viable child. When we have an uncertainty of whether he's an 8-month child, in which case he's a nafil, or a 9-month child, in which case he is considered to be viable, then we have a machlekes. And it depends on the situation. If he was piei kumes, he simply yawned and passed away, and it was prior to 30 days, then all agree we must suspect that he's a nafil, that he was undeveloped, and he was not viable. In a case where he was nafal min hagag, if he died as a result of an external cause, then we have a machlekes. According to Rav Shimon Gamliel, we must suspect that perhaps he's a nafil, and we regard him as a mace, and therefore his mother is required to undergo chalitza if this was her only child. We're uncertain as to the status of his child, unless he survived for 30 days. In that case, he demonstrated his viability. He demonstrated that he's a bar kayama, he's chai, and therefore he is not considered to be a suffix nafil. Whereas according to the Chachamim, in this case where he died due to an external cause, we have no reason to suspect, to believe, to have a chashash that he's a nafil, and therefore they consider to be a full-fledged chai, a bar kayama, even if he's less than 30 days. We learned also regarding a child who was born after 8 months of pregnancy, so within the 8th month he's a ben shmoyne chadashim. Now if it's a newborn child whom we suspect that perhaps he's a 8-month child, we can do mila, because although he's a nafil, he's not viable. There's no concern there, because you're merely cutting flesh and there's no malacha taking place. Regarding a behema, that behema is asa ba'achila. Regarding the shchita, is a shchita metar, we have a machlekes. And we concluded regarding androgynous, according to Rabbi Yehuda, specifically by mila, the chiv of androgynous is a definite chiv.